They smiled at you every single day. They laughed at your jokes. They showed up at your events. They shook your hand. And the entire time, they were building something you could not see. Not a friendship, not a connection. A plan. There are people walking through your life right now who have already decided what they are going to do to you. They are just waiting. And patience, real, calculated, years-long patience, is the most dangerous weapon a human being can carry. What you are about to hear will change the way you look at the people closest to you. Because the most devastating revenge is never the kind that arrives in anger. It is the kind that arrives in silence. After years of it, most people think of revenge as something hot. A reaction, an explosion, something that happens in the moment when the pain is freshest and the emotion is loudest. But psychology suggests there is another kind of revenge entirely. Cold revenge. Calculated, patient, invisible. The kind that takes months to build, sometimes years, sometimes longer. And the people who operate this way are not driven by out-of-control emotion. They are driven by something far more disciplined. Something that looks from the outside like complete calm. That is what makes them so difficult to see coming. To understand why some people choose the long game, you have to understand what happens inside the mind after a severe wound. When a person experiences deep humiliation or betrayal, the kind that strikes at the core of who they believe they are, the brain registers it as a threat to survival. Not a minor inconvenience, not a setback. A threat. And in that moment, two different responses become possible. The first is visible rage, immediate retaliation, the kind that everyone can see. The second is suppression, the decision, conscious or unconscious, to go quiet. To smile, to wait, to remember. Research has shown that people who suppress strong emotional responses do not eliminate those emotions. They compress them. And compressed emotion does not disappear. It pressurizes. And the longer it is held down, the more force it builds. Here is where it gets interesting. Psychology suggests that people who choose long-term revenge planning often share a specific internal experience. They feel at the moment of their wounding completely powerless. Not just hurt, powerless. Maybe they were publicly embarrassed and had no way to respond. Maybe they were betrayed by someone with more influence, more money, more social standing. Maybe they were dismissed, overlooked, or discarded by someone who never expected consequences. And in that moment of powerlessness, the mind makes a quiet decision. If I cannot win today, I will win eventually. And that decision becomes a private promise. One that never gets spoken out loud. One that gets carried into every room, every interaction, every conversation with the person who caused the wound. Invisible, patient, absolute. Think about the dynamics you have seen in American workplaces. The employee who was passed over for a promotion they deserved, publicly undermined by a manager who took credit for their work, dismissed in a meeting in front of colleagues. Most people watch that employee absorb the humiliation and assume it is over. They assume the quietness that follows is acceptance. In many cases, it is not. In many cases, the quietness is strategy. The employee begins to document everything, every inconsistency, every policy violation, every private conversation that reveals something that should not be revealed. They do not act immediately. They wait. They build a file that grows thicker every month. They make themselves indispensable so that when the moment comes, their absence will be felt. They cultivate relationships with people in positions the manager fears. And one day, sometimes 2 years later, sometimes 5, the moment arrives. And they move. Quietly, precisely, with everything they have been collecting. And the manager never saw it coming. Because the manager mistook quietness for defeat. But this is only the beginning. Because long-game revenge is not limited to workplaces. In relationships, it operates with even greater precision. Psychology suggests that in deeply toxic or narcissistic relationships, the discarded partner sometimes does not react the way the other person expects. Instead of begging, instead of exploding, instead of disappearing, they go still. They become friendly, cooperative, almost suspiciously calm. And while appearing to move on, they are watching, learning every weakness, every insecurity, every person the other side values. They are mapping the territory with the patience of someone who has already decided this is not a sprint. This is a marathon, and they have already started running. Have you ever looked back at a situation and realized that someone had been positioning themselves against you for a long time before you noticed? That decisions they made months ago suddenly looked different in hindsight. That the timing of certain events was not coincidence at all. That what you thought was random was actually sequential. Most people dismiss this feeling as paranoia. Psychology suggests it sometimes is not. Because long-game strategists are skilled at creating the appearance of randomness. They understand that the best move looks like no move at all. Here is where it gets darker. Research has shown that sustained revenge planning changes the planner. Not just when a person dedicates significant mental and emotional resources to a long-term goal, even a destructive one, the brain begins to organize itself around that goal. It becomes the lens through which everything else is filtered. New information is evaluated based on whether it helps or hinders the plan. Relationships are assessed based on their strategic value. Even small daily decisions begin to be made with the end goal in mind. The revenge does not just occupy a corner of the mind. Over time, it becomes the architecture of it. And this is where the long game begins to cost the player far more than they originally agreed to pay. Think about what years of sustained focus on another person's destruction does to your own life. The energy that could have been directed toward building something new is instead being poured into dismantling something old. The mental space that could have been used for creativity, connection, or growth is occupied by strategy. The emotional bandwidth that could have been given to people who deserve it is being rationed for a war that the other side may not even know is happening. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the person you are becoming during the years of planning is not the person you were before the wound. You are being shaped by the obsession, refined by it, and not always in the direction you would choose if you were thinking clearly. Psychology suggests that long-game revenge planners often reach a point, sometimes just before the moment of execution, sometimes just after, where something unexpected happens. They realize that the version of themselves that needed this revenge is no longer the version of themselves that exists. Years have passed. They have changed. The wound that felt unsurvivable at the time has somehow been survived. And the plan that once felt like the only possible response to unbearable pain now sits in front of them like a blueprint for a building they no longer want to live in. Some people stop at this point. They fold the blueprint, they walk away. They realize that the years of planning taught them discipline, patience, and strength, and that those qualities can be redirected towards something that does not require anyone else's destruction. But others do not stop. They have invested too much to walk away. The sunk cost of years of patience feels too heavy to abandon. And so they move forward. Not because the pain is still fresh, but because stopping feels like admitting it was all for nothing. This is the final trap of the long game. The moment when the revenge stops being about the original wound and becomes about the investment. About the years. About the identity built around being the person who never forgot. Who never forgave. Who waited. And this is where the long game player becomes indistinguishable from the person they set out to destroy. Because they are now also someone who made another person the center of their universe for years, who allowed another person's actions to dictate the shape of their own life, who gave their most irreplaceable resource, time, to something built entirely around someone else. Awareness does not erase the anger. It does not pretend the original wound was not real. But it asks a question that the long game rarely leaves room for. What would these years have looked like if they had been spent building something of your own? Not destroying something of theirs. Building something of yours. Because the greatest revenge that psychology actually supports, the one with the least psychological cost and the most lasting impact, is not executing a plan. It is becoming someone the plan was never necessary for. Someone whose life became so full, so built, so genuinely theirs, that the person who caused the wound became irrelevant. Not forgiven, not forgotten. Just small. And getting smaller. Every single day.